Okay, I think we are ready to go. If you hear squeaking, it's a chair. It's not yet my old bones. So welcome to today's conversation about the current state of our global stability or instability, whichever notion you prefer. My name is Peter Schlosser. I'm Vice President, Vice Provost of Global Futures, and I'm Director of the Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. Before beginning and introducing the participants in the conversation today, I would like to remind you that this Saturday from 1 to 5 is ASU's open door. Often these events are known as open house, but I think here it's open door. Global Futures will host a number of activities and programs here at the Walton Center, but also at what is now ISTB 10, formerly known as Wrigley Hall. And it would be great if you could attend and bring friends, family, and help to show the work that we all are doing together to work towards a better future. And if you would like to see more about the program, you can go to the website opendoor.asu.edu. But just to set the stage here, today is February 23rd. Tomorrow, February 24th, is the 1-year anniversary since Russia invaded Ukraine. And since then, about 42 people lost their life, and that is not counting soldiers. About 57,000 are injured, more than 15,000 are missing. Approximately 14 million people are displaced, either within Ukraine or out to the outside. And in terms of damage, more than 350 billion have been accumulated so far, and we are far from seeing an end. But that's just one hotspot. If we are looking at stability around the globe or instability, we have nations throughout Africa who are facing conflicts of their own. Brazil recently saw an uprising that's similar to the one that we saw in the US in January 6, 2021. Still a lot of debate around that happening. Each time you switch on the news, you will be reminded of that and how split society is about that, what that meant actually. Globally, nearly 110 million people are displaced currently, either as refugees of violence, conflict, persecution, human rights violations, or extreme events, including climate-based disasters, or as we recently saw, quote unquote, natural disasters that perturb public order. So what does this level of worldwide instability mean for the future we are heading towards, especially the next generations? And how is the war in Ukraine an indicator of what we might face? So we will have a conversation around these issues with our two distinguished panelists, Ilana Orlik, who is a President's Professor in the School of International Letters and Cultures, who also directs the Central European Cultural Collaborative. He's Director of the Romanian and Central European Study Abroad and a distinguished Global Future Scholar. She was awarded Romania's highest cultural distinction, Meritul Cultural al Romaniei, and sorry, Ilana, that I slaughtered that, and finally, she serves as Honorary Consul General of Romania here in Arizona. Next to me, we have Margaret Hansen, who is an assistant professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies. Margaret's research focuses on authoritarian politics and factors which stabilize or conversely undermine dictators and aspiring dictators control, and her emphasis is on the former Soviet Union. So let's start with one of the hotspots presently that has highlighted so many weaknesses in our societal stability, the war between Russia and Ukraine. It's really a stark reminder of how quickly we can experience instability at the local, regional level, but also with effects onto global scales. And if we look at it, on the one hand, it came very quickly, but on the other hand, of course, we had precursors with the occupation of Crimea, which happened a few years before, and the general evolution of what was the former Soviet Union. So looking at that, what are the historical contexts and geopolitical issues that might further instability? Ilyana, if you would want to take that, and then we will move on to Margaret.
First of all, thank you for having me here today. It's an honor. I have always wanted to study political science, but could not because I was born and raised in the Socialist Republic of Romania, and the only choice was Marxism. So this is a privilege. Allow me to go back to 2021. 2021 is a time when Putin feels on top of the world. And I think this is a key element in starting a conversation. He has eviscerated the civil society. He has gotten rid of his political adversaries. He has good connections with China. And finally, he has pushed Russia to a point from where Russia had disappeared in 1991, when it became very clear that the United States has in so many ways won the Cold War. So now he's back into the central focus, and he feels that he needs to reappropriate what belonged to the Soviet Union, what in his mind is Russia. Of course, before that, there had been Georgia, Abkhazia, and Ossetia, and there was Crimea, and no one said much of anything. And even the sanctions have not done much to discourage him or make a really severe impact on Russia. So this is a moment when he is ready to appropriate Ukraine, which in his mind is not a country. It is not a country, it is not a different nation. So he thinks of Belarus, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova. I'm not going to bring in the Baltic states for obvious reasons, but these three, these are little principalities, little fiefs of the Russian empire, which is Soviet empire, which he's trying to rebuild. And so what I would like to say for the beginning in this conversation is that Ukraine is only a pawn. It is the center of a proxy war. Putin is actually trying to bring himself and Russia into prominence. And if you look at all his speeches, if you listen to him recently or not so recently, he's mainly talking about the West. He's talking about the United States. He's barely bringing in Russia. And one final point, we in the United States, in the West, very seldom think of Russia. But in Russia, everybody thinks about the West and the United States at all times. So then there is this added element of empowerment that makes Putin engage in a war with the West and the United States, NATO and the European Union, that is. So I believe that this is the larger point to be discussed.
That's a great start into the conversation, because there are many who believe that, exactly as you said, that Putin wants to reestablish the former Soviet Union, and that he uses that to also juxtapose the then expanded Russia against the West, and the West is including Europe and the US. Margaret, now looking to the East, and Ilana already mentioned China, which role does China play in that conflict in terms of either escalating it or de-escalating it? Just recently, we heard in the media the talk of a potential third world war that might be stirred by China. Do we really have to think about that, or is that taken out of context? That was a New York Times article by Freeman.
So I think that with respect to China, its role to date has been primarily to hedge. While there have been reports and suspicions about arms deals and sidestepping of sanctions, there has been increased trade between the two. And China has incorporated and helped spread Russian talking points regarding the war. At the same time that they maybe don't want Russia to lose, because they are allies and have a shared interest in challenging Western geopolitical power, they also don't want to back a loser. But I think the broader question here really, when we're talking about geopolitical instability, has to do with the rise of personalism that we've seen in authoritarian regimes around the world. And so we know from studying different types of authoritarian regimes, not all dictatorships are structured equally, and they tend to have differing levels of constraints and different types of information problems. For example, at the top, as these regimes like Russia under Putin and China under Xi become more personalistic in terms of how they're governed, they are more likely to become belligerent on the world stage, and they're also more likely to make egregious missteps, such as Putin's now famous proclamation that he would be able to take Ukraine in 3 days, because they surround themselves with yes men and have issues getting accurate information about conditions on the ground.
So just following up quickly on that, if it would come down to the wire, do you think China would take a position, or would they just stay out there trying to protect their own standing?
So, while I'm not an expert on Chinese politics, my sense would be that China has an interest in seeing how this unfolds because of its interest in Taiwan. And it's garnering a lot of useful information by letting Russia take the first step in terms of challenging international norms. And there's obviously a lot of moving variables here that make it impossible to predict an exact outcome without knowing those ahead of time.
And I guess that's one of the factors of the world we are moving into, is the uncertainty in terms of, or is our inability to really predict, having to live with some very weak or very uncertain forward projections. So if we are looking at the world as a whole, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is just one of many examples that seem to indicate that democracy is weakening. And we hear quite a bit of language that is directly addressing that. I mean, if you look at Biden's address in Ukraine, in Poland, now going, but also internally, the language, not just addressing the situation between nations, but also within a nation. We hear a lot of language within the US between the big parties, that one is actually seen as threatening democracy, whereas the other is seen as being radically left. So we have that discussion, and worldwide, it appears as if there is a decline in democracy over the past few decades. We see that in Brazil, Italy, but even Germany, or Poland, Hungary. There are many examples around the globe where we see movements that weaken democracy. So Ilana, if we look at the future, will we have democracy at the same level as we enjoyed in the past in the future? And if yes, what kind of model would it follow?
It's a very complicated, loaded question, but I will try to bring in some aspects that might address that issue. And I would like to start once again with Russia, where there are two very clear notions of creating the Homo Sovieticus, who is built a certain way to give his life and his family and everything else to the country. But then there is the other aspect where the Russians do understand that at the end of so many decades of Stalinism and of bashing on the West, life is better in the West in general. So then this other second attribute would be looking for flaws. So they are looking for flaws in democratic systems. And I think that that is very important because the advancement toward a beneficial and embraced democracy is really coming across stumbling blocks, which are created by this very attitude. And I can only give you examples. Putin always assumed that he is a communicator. He was a spy, but his main point was to find flaws and weaknesses in other people, in other systems. So what Russia, what Putin have been doing is looking for flaws in order to show the Russian people and the world that all the democratic agenda advanced by the West and by the US is a fig leaf and a mere, what is the thing that you put on your tooth? A veneer. Is a mere veneer in order to make globally and for Americans the impression that they live in a democracy, because in fact they do not. And so the point is not for their side, for the Russian side, to really embrace or research and understand issues that we face every day. It is to use the way in which conflict may appear when we discuss those issues and forward them as agendas. Let's take, for instance, Trump. Trump was a gift from God to the Russians, because by calling him brilliant, they could see how a fool could actually denigrate NATO, make a sham of democracy and democratic and civil society, disregard the European Union potential. So my point is that democracy would be very well served if it had been for these roadblocks that undermine the healthy conflict that do not have a chance to be aired out because they are used against the very honest and sincere effort to advance democratically. I hope that makes sense.
Margaret, taking it from the other side, there are voices saying that authoritarian states and authoritarian government structures are better suited to deal with some of the issues of the future, such as climate change, because that has been one example that was named explicitly in these conversations. In your view, what is the future of authoritarian states? There seems to be a rise towards them. if we average over the last, whatever, let's say half a century. And will that continue, or will they go to a certain peak and then it follows a natural decline? Where do you see the role of authoritarian states in our future?
So authoritarian governments and regimes, like democracies, are always changing and evolving. And you're very right to point attention to this issue of democratic backsliding that's been concerning political scientists for some time now, and in particular threats to liberal democracies, which in places that had been thought to be immune to it. But this is also very difficult to separate from the current conflict in Ukraine, given that Russia has supported, as Ileana was referring to, misinformation that undermines trust in democracy by providing support for extremist political movements in Europe, the US, and elsewhere, most recently with the pro-Russian Moldovan party leader who tried to protest against that country's pro-Western president, being just one of many recent examples. And so as we have seen the rise of populist movements, this has given really Russia an opening to exploit it's given Russia the opportunity to drive a further wedge in democracies in the hope to shift them towards more authoritarian governance. But we have also seen an effort to fight back against that with some of these populist leaders, for example, in Brazil, not winning re-election. So I think it's a very dynamic situation where we'll see autocrats like Putin continue to learn and adapt, especially to the new information environment where they're able to capitalize on things like social media. But I don't think it's the end all be all for democracy either, as we have seen its resiliency in the face of those threats.
Following on that, will most of the resistance against the rise of authoritarian structures come from the outside of nations, or will it come from within, that the population actually puts up resistance against it?
I think these two factors are very interrelated. So my own work with co-authors suggests that on support for democracy, and in particular individual level support, suggests that how people understand democracy plays a big role in whether or not they're willing to support it, including by showing up on the street to protest or at the ballot box. But of course, how people learn about democracy is in part from experience, but also from their information environment and their civic education, which is why the work that institutions like ASU do in terms of engaging in civics education and things like that is also very important for providing a bulwark against authoritarianism.
And one quick follow-up on that. Do people still understand what democracy actually means?
We do find in examining the World Values Survey data that the majority of people correctly define the very basic core definition of democracy as free and fair elections. So that's some good news.
Okay. Ilana, if Russia conquers Ukraine, it in essence will be left with a destroyed country. And we already heard some numbers, and I think the 350 billion is a low estimate. At the end, when all of that is said and done, and in one scenario, Russia would conquer Ukraine, it would inherit a destroyed country down to its bare bones. Does Russia actually, why would Russia do that? And would they actually have the will to rebuild? And if they have the will, would they have the resources to rebuild? Or what would the future of Ukraine actually hold?
Mm-hmm. So Ukraine was actually destroyed before, during the famine. it was starved. 7 million Ukrainians died. And yet Stalin appropriated Ukraine and benefited from having added Ukraine to the Soviet family and collectivization. So what the Russians did at that time in Ukraine is they Russified it. They brought in people from other parts of the Soviet Union to populate the region. I have a feeling that should Russia win the war, which I don't think will happen, but let's put the worst first, they would do the same thing. They will bring in people from elsewhere. Russia is not interested in welfare. It is not interested in progress. It is not interested in community building, institutions, academics, nothing like that. Russia is about power, totalitarianism, and the rule of a system that destroys lives. And so the way in which we wonder about rebuilding a country are not commensurate with the way in which Putin's desire to appropriate territory and make himself look like the great leader and the descendant of great tsars really plays in his mind. So Margaret was talking about Ukraine and the very corrupt man that is, I assume, Ilan Shor, the Israeli citizen, and the way in which Russia is currently undermining another country, which is the Republic of Moldova, which is kept poor. It is kept without roads. Next to it, there is Transnistria, which Russia has owned for the longest time, where again, development, happiness, advancement are just unknown entities. They do not play a part. The Republic of Moldova, by the way, fearing the threats of the Russian occupation, has declared, the Republic of Moldova, that it will blow up its only airport if the Russians occupy or attack or aggress Moldova, simply because they do understand that Russia is not interested in having their land, their beauty, their people, their culture. They're interested in destroying, but at the same time building that insane type of totalitarian, autocratic regime. It's an autocracy, moving from a white to a red Tsar to Putin. Again, amass as much territory as possible. That is why Russia is the largest country in the world. It's not the quality of people's lives. It's just a matter of might makes right.
On that point, how long will the Russian population go along with that? Because clearly they suffer. Some of the suffering is hidden from the larger population, but there is building pressure that is felt by the population. At this point, they still seem to support Putin, but for how long will that last?
They do not know that they suffer, which is why for the longest time, Soviet regimes have not issued passports. People cannot travel. Now that they do, here is the other thing. You mentioned democracy, Putin's recent speech, talking about the fact that the West makes even God look neutral, talking about the fact that the children will be engaged in gay parades, having the church, the Orthodox Church of Russia, by Putin's side. This gives the Russian people a sense of being engaged in some sort of a crusade that is based on moral values, normative values that do not decompose a very gelled Third Rome. They have not given up that idea. So that is why you see a Patriarch Kirill, a former KGB agent, I might add, always with Putin, because the Russians are convinced that their traditions, their customs, their language, their faith are going to be preserved within a state that is disciplined and ruled with an iron fist.
Interesting perspective, and also a view into the Russian soul in a way. Margaret, there is quite a bit of support from Europe and the US to Ukraine to hold off being occupied by Russia. Can this support actually prevent Russia from winning the war? Or is that something that will have a certain effect, but at some point, the war of attrition will play in favor of Russia?
So that's a pretty broad question in the sense that winning can mean a lot of different things, right? Relatively few wars end in a decisive rout, historically speaking. So I think winning is defined by goals. For Ukraine, obviously that means pushing Russia out of its territory and retaining its independence. But I think the intent of the US and NATO coalition is to support Ukraine so that Russian advancement and aggression can be contained, slowed, and exhausted. So in that sense, I'm relatively optimistic, but of course, this is contingent not only on time, and there are so many factors that go into how long a war is likely to continue and political winds. And to go, this ties in with your previous question, speaking about, how long will the Russian population support the war? The dissidents have largely fled, so would we even have the possibility of regime change there? And I think this is an important but a very difficult question and a really big piece of the puzzle. Because it's hard to know the real proportion who do in fact support it. It certainly exists. But a lot of Russians tend to be very apathetic or don't see other options when it comes to politics. So there's, I think, an underappreciated impact of the prevalence of propaganda and misinformation within Russia is that, especially for older populations, it does have a major impact, but for a lot of people, it has just really caused them to distrust everything and to feel that even if among those who I've interviewed, for example, who have fled Russia and opposed the war, that there isn't anything they can do about it. There is no sense of agency. But at the same time, highly repressive regimes like Russia's tend to appear very stable until suddenly they are not. You remember, virtually no one predicted the collapse of the USSR. And the same is true for many other lesser headline-grabbing authoritarian regimes in the world. So a lot of this will really depend on whether in Russia, whether the impact of the war is felt more widely, because right now, it's not really felt that way in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and who people blame for that impact when it does happen. Conversely, it also depends on the continuation of Western support, which is itself a very complex variable for that equation. So again, while I'm also optimistic, there's simply too many factors in play to really be able to make a good prediction.
And there are actually discussions in the US that there are rising voices saying the support should not be at the level that it is, that the US should look at the internal issues first. But to your point about rapid transitions, we actually have seen in the past that Russia can become very unstable. For example, the Russian Revolution was one of these transition points. And I think it is when people feel that they are either powerless to the point where they are willing to give their life for the cause, or when they just don't see a future for them. So on that complexity that we are seeing now, one factor that I always feel is playing into Russia's hand with respect to the support that comes from other nations is the existence of nuclear weapons. A lot of the tactical moves and strategic moves circles one way or the other around, will somebody pull the trigger on at least a tactical, if not a larger nuclear weapon? Are we actually seeing the curse of the nuclear weapon coming back to us that we had thought we had pushed a little bit into the background, Ilana?
I think that, I think that one of the points that we might want to address is that in the beginning, the Russians, and especially the Russians, the elite, felt that Putin is way too kind and way too mild. They insisted on a much more aggressive attitude in the beginning. And Putin was convinced that he was going to take Ukraine and everybody is going to look the other way. So it was only later that he realized that that is not the case. So now we see the hardliners, we see Medvedev, we see Petrushenko, who are all of a sudden actually having Putin become more and more aggressive. I know that from this side, it may not look this way, but in reality, it's like the Praetorian Guard for a Roman emperor. I mean, they want to succeed. They want to show the West that they are better. And so in the context of continued defeat on the battlefield, the nuclear solution is the only one left. And so it is a solution that they will embrace because it is the kind of way out, the only one that they can see. You mentioned the Russian soul, and again, orthodoxy, the idea that suffering and all of, and you mentioned the Occident and the Orient, the idea in the Orient that dying will take you to heaven if you have an heroic death and you take others with you who are enemies, infidels. Well, Russia is somewhere in the middle in its orthodoxy. The idea that they will have heroic death defending their motherland. And Putin is right up in that situation. I don't understand why the elite is so given to Putin's agenda, but there was a gathering at the stadium in Moscow. And if you watched it, it was all great song, patriotic songs, flags, and thousands of people who were applauding and embracing every word that Putin had to say. So this is, they also were paid $7 a piece to be there.
Many of them were paid.
I know that, but still you would see husbands embracing their wives when Putin made an appearance. See, I told you he would be here. So it is that very scary notion that they will go down with the ship because it's part of their worldview and their faith.
Scary outlook. Before going to questions from the audience, Margaret, I wanted to close with one question that leads us a bit away from military conflict. Besides military conflict, we see pressures from environmental degradation, from pressure onto our planet, from what is called natural disasters, such as the one that we saw through the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. If you're looking ahead, what role does that play, this increased pressure from environmental degradation compared to the quote unquote traditional military conflict?
So I think you might be implying regime change here, which certainly natural disasters and other crises can and do precipitate regime change, but political revolutions are also a very complex phenomena because regimes are ultimately constructed by people, and people learn and adapt to their environment. So certainly a natural disaster, for example, like the earthquake in Turkey, has generated some rumblings of discontent in Turkey due to the widespread corruption there that many people blame for the building collapses. That is certainly no guarantee that Erdogan will fall, however, because dictators like him expend considerable effort in learning to make their regimes resilient to these exact kinds of unexpected threats, which to bring us back to an earlier point, these regimes are very strong until suddenly they are not, in part because when they fall from, let's say, uprisings from below, that relies on something we call tipping effects, where once you get a critical mass of people moving, they're more likely to fall. Other threats, for example, large-scale migration will likely put pressure on, due to environmental degradation, climate change, will also likely put pressure on democratic and authoritarian governments alike. But I think democratic governments are in many ways more well-placed to respond adaptively to those threats than autocratic ones whose inclination tends to be to engage in repression rather than accountability.
Are we actually sophisticated enough to see the preconditioning of these abrupt transitions? Because they're not coming out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. There is a preconditioning that at some point then just needs a small trigger and it flips. Do we know how to see that build up, the preconditioning?
There are certain factors, if we're talking about regime change, for example, that we know increase the probability. Things like high levels of corruption, for example, are factors that get us part of the way there. But structural factors can never get us all the way there either.
May I just add something? And it could be just that I am too much of a student of history, but usually there are three things that traditionally led to the change: the plague, the earthquake, and the drought. So now we had the plague, we had COVID, we have the earthquake. And by the way, there are seismic issues every day in Romania because of the proximity. I hear that it has not rained in France for 35 days. So all these elements just seem to be there. All the ingredients seem to be there. I don't know what the end could be, but it could be the nuclear disaster. We do have the plague, as I said, we do have the earthquake, and there are very incredible changes, climatic changes everywhere.
So final question to both of you. Given all the pressures that we have seen, all the conflict, partially unexpected conflict on the military side, if you're looking ahead, do you think we are moving into a world that is more unstable than what we have seen in the past? Or is it more or less the same level of stability and instability, just of a different kind?
Well, world history hasn't exactly been characterized by stability overall. So in that sense, I think this is nothing new. The types of threats we are facing are certainly novel. And my hope would be that we learn to respond to them in a way that enhances stability.
Do you have hope from our ability to learn from the past, in the past?
I have hope in our ability to adapt to the changes in front of us. We aren't always that great at learning from history.
Yeah. Well, according to one of my favorite literary figures, Mark Twain, history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. Lenin, Stalin, Putin, we've seen it before. but the sun also rises. So yes, there are cycles. I think we have been very fortunate, in my generation at least, immediately after the war, but this is unusual. So now payback time may be in order, but it seems as if after a certain amount of time, there is another disaster and then the tide turns and so it goes. And this has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine, but when the Roman legions were trying to conquer what is today the United Kingdom, their prized legionnaires came from today's Romania. And those guys were so horrified by the marshes and those people who lived in Britannia, they could not understand how they could be so savage. Here's where we are today, 2,000 years later, and that's not very long.
Yeah, so I sense a mixture of realism and hope. So with that, let's open up to questions from the audience. Anybody? There is somebody in the first row.
So there was a question on World War.
Just hold it a little bit closer.
There was a question
Very
on
good.
World War III, and you were talking about how, in the context of continued defeat on the battlefield, nuclear options are the only one left. So is that kind of related? Do you think that the world's only going to be like Russia's only going to do a nuclear option if they continue to face, they're not doing so great on the battlefield, and then how would the other countries respond to something like that? Because that's been a concern, I know, geopolitically for, I guess, the last year.
So I think I differ a little from Ileana's take on the nuclear option. I think that, so Putin is someone who sees any kind of concession or willingness to compromise as weakness, and it tends to encourage him to go further. I think we saw a microcosm of this with the grain embargo, where they threatened to stop ships from leaving, and the ships just kept going, and Putin backed down. So I think I think it's justifiable to worry about nuclear weapons, certainly. But because we know that Putin is using this threat very strategically to stymie assistance, the speed of assistance to Ukraine, to try and keep, the West and other parties from being even more involved in the conflict. It's something wielded as a tool, but because Russia is trying to capture Ukraine for its resources more than anything, I'm not sure that it necessarily serves the interests of the Russian elite or Putin to take that step because of the risks involved to Russia itself.
Oh, but you said that Russia doesn't care.
No, I did say that.
Oh, yeah. But that doesn't involve the resources.
Yeah, so a lot of this is really, it's tough to know the calculations in the Kremlin, right? But certainly Russia doesn't care if it destroys the Ukrainian people or a lot of the institutions, the government, the culture. In fact, that's their goal. But Ukrainian farmland, oil and gas resources that are located there, ports, those are things that are very useful to Ukraine, or to Russia rather.
Yeah.
Also to Ukraine, obviously. But.
Yeah, well, you are right. I would somewhat disagree with that, in the sense that, do not forget, when Napoleon was approaching Moscow, the Muscovites just burned it. I mean, the Russians do have that sort of incredible tendency to just destroy even themselves. Again, I'm thinking about the Russians in the face of the Napoleonic troops. But then I'm also thinking about the fact that by listening to Putin's speeches, I have listened to his voice, the register of his voice, and increasingly he sounds like a madman. If you listen to the way he talks, this speech in the auditorium, you would say he lost it. I think he's in a position of a madman, and madmen in history, unfortunately, have existed, and this is how we know they were mad, because they caused so much destruction. But there is truth in the fact that there is still an entire population that will have to put an end to this. I agree. It will be interesting to see.
Yeah, I think also the elite, many of them were not happy with the decision to start the war. And you're right, man, you're not wrong. Bad men are very dangerous, and that's a valid fear. But I do wonder whether something like a palace coup, while very difficult, because Putin has taken steps to protect against that, the consequences that would come from beginning nuclear war could potentially have an impact on Russian politics at the elite level.
Ariel.
I'm very interested in this idea that you brought up, Margaret, of the personified authoritarian regimes. And if I can sit here and name the ones that I can identify in the world now or recently, they're all men. And we're talking about madmen and strongmen. So there's a gender issue at play here. So I am curious about, with our global communications network, the power of someone like Putin to inspire other strongmen to try to take over their country, and then also what that looks like for women as we go forward, and also the LGBT community as we talk about this moral crusade.
I didn't hear the last part.
The LGBT community, as you mentioned, Ilana, the moral crusade that some people in Russia feel like they might be on right now.
Yeah, so the personification of power, could you repeat that first part of your question again? Sorry.
Sure, I will try to word it the same way. But you mentioned that these people, these regimes are personified. So you mentioned Xi and Putin, and then we can think about Bolsonaro or Duarte, but they're all men. And so talking about the issues for women in the future and gender, and then also the idea that this is a moral crusade.
So I think often in these regimes, sort of more things like gender issues are weaponized as a way to create a distinction between their regimes protecting, for example, conservative orthodox values versus the decadent West. So it's a convenient issue that resonates for that they can draw on. But of course, personalist regimes can occur with left and right-leaning tendencies. We've seen the rise of a lot of right-leaning populist leaders, like you mentioned, in recent years, but they occur on the other end of the spectrum too. So I think in terms of the rise of personalist dictators is often accompanied by attempts to capitalize on whatever value divisions exist in a particular country or culture. And so when some of these leaders see those opportunities to drive a wedge in the population and to create support, they'll take it, whatever that happens to look like in a given country context.
Sally has the last question, then we reach the end of our time.
Oh, the last. Yes, thank you. I actually had two questions, but I'll try to condense them. And one follows on your question, I think, a little bit. So, Ileana, nice to see you. I've been listening to your view about the Russian history. I think it's really important. And I also think that the slide you took into Imperial Russia from the Soviet Union is really important to the psychology of this, and the role of Ukraine in Russian history as very central to the development of the empire is another piece of the puzzle and the emotional attachment to this place. But I've noticed recently, I used to hear Putin and other Russian leaders talk about Russia, the motherland, or Mother Russia. But recently he started calling it fatherland. And I wonder if you have noticed that, or if it's interchangeable, or it's a translation issue from Russian to English. So that's my question to you. My other question to Margaret is, you used the word populism. And I wonder if we're needing to redefine that term in light of the last decade, let's say, or if it still means the same thing to you from your perspective.
Ilana?
Yes. Very good question and very perceptive, very good perception of the nuances there. I will start by saying that Putin recently presented as a great threat the fact that the West is looking at God as being neutral. To him, the gender, not feminine, masculine, but neutral, to him that was just anathema. But in terms of what you were saying, Sally, so Russia is always Matriona. The patron saint is Maria. Putin has two biological daughters we know of, and he insisted that the first one be Maria. If you read most of the Russian literature, there is always a Marusia, Matriona, and so on and so forth. So it is the figure in religion to which Russians attach themselves. And if you look at Solzhenitsyn, for instance, yes, it is Maria, but it is a Maria who is not a woman. She's a saint. Therefore, she's not perceived as a feminine entity. It's the issue of sainthood. And as far as fatherland, and here I only speculate, it is the Vaterland. I'm sorry about my German, but it's that sense of masculinity, of patriarchal appropriation of the fatherland that exists in some of the patriotic songs, not just in Russia, and of course the patriarchal societies. So there's a combination of the two, but not really in the sense of gender, because again, Maria, the feminine, is always distilled from the realities of biology. Let's say, natural possibilities.
Margaret?
I was so caught up in listening to your response. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question one more time? Yes, thank you. So I think populism, the basic idea behind populism is that there's some sort of corrupt elite and there's the people. And I think that basic idea has remained relatively constant, but who constitutes the corrupt elite and who constitutes the good, virtuous people shifts over time and from society to society. So that's part of the reason I think populism is a very difficult topic to study, because who those labels are attached to can be very different. I mean, if you look at, for example, Venezuela versus Russia or something like that, who the labels are being attached to and how they're being constructed in political discourse is different.
My favorite is Marine Le Pen. I had to say that.
So that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you very much, Ilana, Margaret, for wonderful contributions. And thank you all for attending. And with that, we will end this session.
Thank you.